Hello everyone, this is Darcinovia here, and I'm back once again with another nonfiction review. Wait, another review of a nonfiction book? That was fast. Well, this particular book I'm going to be talking about is not a book that takes very long to read. In fact, it's easy to read. It has various different topics. And yes, I know I'm going to be reviewing another book that Michael Parenti wrote. But the reason why I'm doing this, because I actually think Black Shirts and Reds is one of the most cited books that I've heard when I hear Marxist Leninists talk about various issues. And it should be cited because I think it is relevant, everything that is said in this book. And I think despite certain parts of the book being outdated, because the book was published in 1997 and it hasn't been updated with later editions, like, Democracy for the Few, another book that I will probably touch on in the future. This book gets into various different topics, and actually, in a book that's like under 200 pages, explains in great detail and does it quick and concise, the consequences of the overthrow of communism. Now, I'm going to get this out of the way because I know, my viewers, some of them are Maoists and Third Worldists, so I'm just going to make this clear. I'm aware on, Michael Parenti, some of his most problematic aspects. He defended the Soviet Union uncritically, despite them practicing social imperialism. Yes, I know. I don't want to hear it because I know this. It's a complicated situation. The Cold War, there was no easy way out. If you didn't defend the Soviet Union and you were a Marxist, you were still labeled as a traitor to the country. If you didn't, you would still be labeled. You're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. And I know this is not going to be popular with my Maoist friends. I don't care. I'm going to make this known. No matter how bad the Soviet Union was, the worst that it did after Stalin, it doesn't compare to what the United States did after World War II, and what it's still doing. The worst that the USSR did didn't even compare to what the United States was doing at this time. Like, look at Afghanistan, which unfortunately this book doesn't really talk too much about the Soviet-Afghan War, which I will have to research in the future. Call it what the Soviet Union do, social imperialism. You can't say this and be honest with yourselves and say that the Soviets were not on the right side in this situation. And I know this is, lesser of two evils, Darcinovia. I thought you're supposed to be an anti-imperialist. What I'm basically saying is that the situation with the Soviet-Afghan War was pretty complicated. And if you look at the state of Afghanistan today versus the socialist, country that Afghanistan was at that time, Afghanistan is a war zone. Generations of children have grown up knowing nothing but non-stop war. And none of these socialist countries were allowed to develop naturally. And I think this is something that's unfortunately lost, on a lot of Marxists. That they can't seem to grasp sometimes that, the conditions these countries in, they developed in this way because of America, the biggest enemy of communism today. Now, he doesn't talk about, China in this book, not very much. He mostly focuses on the Soviet Union in here and the consequences of, the Soviet Union collapse. But he doesn't, uncritically say, the Soviet Union was a paradise or anything. He does talk about the problematic aspects of the Soviet Union and Cuba and Vietnam. He does do that. But he also talks about, left-wing anti-communism and, the problems that socialist countries had. And he even talks briefly about Stalin. He doesn't really touch on Stalin very much, which I think he could have gone into more detail. At least that's one criticism I have of the book. But I think the best chapters in this book, in my opinion, and I'm just going to say this, and you can read these individually. Radical Fascism, which talks about capitalism's, and big business's relationship with fascism. And talks about, the second chapter, also let us now praise the revolution, which talks about the consequences of counter-revolution and communism in Wonderland, and, basically debunks whatever nonsense that utopian, socialists who, idolize the Soviet Union and these socialist countries, basically, these places were so wonderful, even though he actually talks about the negatives. And, of course, left-wing communism, I think, anti-communism is a good chapter. Now, I think the best, there's a lot of chapters that are good in this book, but I think the weakest is chapter 5, considering I think there's a lot more he could have, gone into when it came to Stalin, but what can you do? That is a particular topic. You can't really sum it up, in a short amount of time. I mean, he spends like less than 10 pages talking about, the Stalin era. The last two chapters, he talks about, like, the aftermath of the fall of the USSR and communism. And I think this chapter is great. Chapter 8, the end of communism. I think a lot of these chapters, you can read these individually, and if you don't want to read the whole book, I'll just give recommendations. If you look at the table of contents, there's like every one of these topics he talks about can easily be their own book, but that's not the purpose of this book. I think the purpose of this book, Michael Parenti wanted to make something easy and accessible for people who want to understand the consequences of the fall of the first socialist country. And regardless what you think of the Soviet Union, regardless what you think of it after Stalin, it cannot be denied that the world objectively changed for the worst after the fall of the USSR. But there's people more qualified and more educated than I am on Soviet history, so I'm not going to discuss this. The whole point of this is for me to talk about why you should, read this book. Black Shirts and Reds, in my opinion, is Michael Parenti's best book. And everything that he says in his lectures, and I've watched a lot of his lectures, a lot. I devoured them religiously when I first got into Marxism, because he was easy to understand, he was passionate, the guy argued passionately, and at the time when I first got into Marxism, I actually admired someone that had the balls to defend the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War, during the Reagan era. And I actually think, despite some of the more problematic aspects, yeah, he defended the Soviet Union. His anti-imperialism was only from America's perspective. But if you ask me, like I said earlier, there's nothing to be gained by, on one hand, criticizing the United States for its imperialism and doing the same to the Soviet Union, especially considering the fact that at the time of the Cold War, America objectively was worse in every way than the Soviet Union, and I feel like defending them and in certain aspects was correct, though uncritically defending them was not correct, though, because what they did was social imperialism at points. But if you look at the state of the world today, Afghanistan as an example, the Soviets were on the right side of that war. Objectively, if you just compare like the kind of people the United States backed, like you cannot tell me with a straight face that it was, justified, not at least critically supporting the Soviet Union and the socialist government of Afghanistan in its fight against, the U.S.-backed forces. But that's not a popular stance, and you know what? You're free to disagree with me. But if you look at Afghanistan today, as fucked up as it is, yes, it was a social imperialist war, and I don't think there was any easy way you could have fucking. I think you were damned if you do and you were damned if you don't. I think condemning the Soviet Union for social imperialism is correct, but I don't know. But the reason I'm bringing this up because this is one thing Michael Parenti is criticized for, and I feel like that is fair to a degree, but I feel like if you know the history of the United States foreign policy and you compare it to the USSR, it's not even a contest that the USSR, was a saint compared to the United States. Whatever crimes it committed doesn't come close. This isn't Soviet apologelia. If I'm accused of that, that's nonsense. Whatever the Soviet Union did wrong, it deserves to be criticized for it. I'm not here to defend the Soviet Union, whatever it did, because that's not the point. The point is, Black Shirts and Reds, along with the other book that I reviewed, I think Michael Parenti, I think more people should be reading about him. Yeah, if there's problematic aspects of him, I'm not going to defend it. I won't. I think it's wrong to uncritically defend the USSR. But I don't think it's that simple, considering the circumstances behind the world were different. Now, China, that I think it's justified to criticize both countries, but I still think America's worse, and I'm not going to change my mind on that at all. Considering if you compare China's handling of the pandemic and compare America, it's objectively, without a shadow of a doubt, the United States is worse. And this is not off topic because, Michael Parenti in his book also talks about in the Eastern Bloc, which I think the chapters that I neglected to mention earlier in this video, the free market paradise, he talks about, how much worse the Eastern Bloc got after the fall of the Soviet Union. Even if they were under social imperialism by the Soviet Union, it's undeniable that these countries were far better off, being satellite states of the Soviet Union than being essentially satellite states of the West. I mean, it's undeniable. Literacy, is down. Child prostitution is a thing in these countries. Life expectancy went down. I mean, in all honesty, I honestly think that the whole thing regarding the Soviet Union, whatever you think of it, it's very complicated. It's a complicated country with a complicated history. And history isn't black and white. It isn't so simple. And Michael Parenti in this book does prove this objectively when he talks about in these chapters. And I will stand by Michael Parenti regarding this. The Soviet Union had a lot of problems. The Soviet Union did a lot of things wrong. But if you compare the world today to what the world was like, when the Soviet Union existed, objectively the world was far more stable. Regardless of the Soviet Union becoming a revisionist state in its final few decades of its life, it did stand for socialism around the world. And its fall has slowly caused the slow decay of every socialist country that still exists. I don't believe in the notion that socialism is completely gone from this world, but it is dying. And there is no strong socialist country to challenge the hegemony of the United States or China. I, for one, don't believe China is socialist. China is a capitalist state. And if you're going to throw around and say, oh, it's not capitalist, it's socialist. Okay, explain to me, why does Michael Parenti in this book, why does he bring up that China isn't socialist? Why does he bring up that Vietnam is losing its socialism, and Cuba? He isn't a stupid man, Michael Parenti. Whether you think he's a Khrushchevite, I'm referring to those who rightfully hate Khrushchev. I fucking hate Khrushchev. He's correct in many of the things in this book. And when I read it for the first time, I didn't understand 80% of the material. Because I wasn't versed enough in Marxism in order to read this book. And in my opinion, don't make the same mistake I did. If you haven't read a single Marxist text yet, don't read Black Shirts and Reds. Wait until you're more versed in Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, or whatever tendency that you tend to, cling to. Make sure you're versed in those first, so you can understand what he's talking about. Because if you don't, you're going to be lost. And when I read this back in I think it was 2017 or early 2018, I don't remember exactly, I didn't understand any of a lot of stuff I read. It's because the mindset when I read back then was different compared to what it is today. Now, I've been rambling for almost 20 minutes now, but I feel like I had to do that because there's a lot of things about this book that I think I could be talking about this book for an hour, because there's a lot to talk about. Every chapter that Michael Parenti wrote in this book in itself could be its own book. In fact, I do think in that way, if you want to, have a brief rundown on, Cold War history and the aftermath of it, I think this is a good place to start, because it's, the chapters are quick and concise and goes into great detail about the Cold War, at least at the time that this book was written, because there's other books that have been written since that actually go into more details about the topics that Michael Parenti talks about. But this is one of the few books written by a Marxist and left-wing writers in general that actually tackles these complex subjects. The history of the Cold War is very complicated. Regardless where we all stand on the Soviet Union, China, the history of the communist struggle is very complicated. We can't be treating it like a religion. And I think Michael Parenti is correct when he discusses that, essentially, in this book. Now, I know it's going to sound like I basically am a stan for Michael Parenti. I'm not. I respect the guy. I respect his passion. I think the guy is one of the best Marxists in America that's currently alive. Do I think he's as good as Huey P. Newton? No, not even close. In my opinion, he doesn't even compare to Huey, Fred Hampton, etc. He doesn't come close to those Marxists, or Mao, or Stalin. Not even close. But if we're going by American Marxists, I consider him one of the best American Marxists. Though, comparing him to the Panthers, he's kind of shit, I will not lie. But I do think that Michael Parenti is one of the better Marxists out there in the United States. And for that alone, I think, I recommend people to read this book. I don't think Michael Parenti, is shit. I don't. But compared to the likes of other Marxists, like Huey, Fred Hampton, he's pretty, tamed by comparison. Anyway, this review has been going on long enough. This is Darsenovia, over and out. And see you guys next time with another video.